Welcome to World Social Studies for Elementary Teachers. This is Lecture C1, Understanding the State. This is the beginning lecture to the section on the development of the international system. How did the world get to look like the way it looks now? The key objectives for this lecture are to understand what the state is, what a sovereign state is, what sets the state apart from other institutions in society. You'll also be able to do the objectives listed on this slide as a result of listening to this presentation. Enlightenment political philosophers used a construct of the state of nature to try to make sense of governments and the role that they played. What would happen if there was no government? What did human society look like before there was such a thing as government? That's what the state of nature is. If we think of what the state of nature might appear like, we have to ask ourselves, what would life be like if you didn't belong to a country? Would there be tribes? Would there be an empire? Would there be corporate identities? Would it just be anarchy? It's interesting to ask this question of what would life be without the state. But while it's interesting, it's very hard to do because the state permeates our idea of what's normal. The life we lived in, the society we grew up in, the societies we interact with when we travel outside of our own community. We're surrounded by states. It's hard to even imagine what a state of nature would look like. The state is the primary actor in international system today. So, to understand the system, to understand the world we live in, we have to first come to understand the state. So, if we ask the question, what is the state? One way to get at what a state is to ask what distinguishes the state as a particular type of organizing humans? What sets that apart from other institutions in society? Like the Boy Scouts, for example. That's an organization. What's different between the state and the Boy Scouts? A German sociologist named Max Weber did a lot of thinking about the state and its reaction and its proper relationship with the citizens who are governed. And so he came up with a pretty good definition, and we're going to use Weber's definition of the state in this presentation. And what Weber said is that the state is a set of institutions within a specified territory that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Now we want to tease out each part of that definition. So he first begins by saying it's a set of institutions. It has a thing like a courthouse, a Congress, a post office, an army. There's things that we can point to that are the state with a capital T and a capital S. But other groupings in our society also have institutions. For example, the Boy Scouts again. They have patrols, they have districts, they have councils. If you belong to the Boy Scouts in Arizona, you're a member of the Grand Canyon Council. So the state is not unique in this regard. Other groups in our society have institutions as well. The next part of his definition is that these institutions exist within a specified geographic territory. So states have borders, and those borders are lines that we pretend have meaning. When you get south of Tucson, you reach a point where there's an imaginary line drawn, and if you're on this side of the line, you're in the United States, and if you're on that side of the line, you're in Mexico. Although on that particular border, you'll know where it is because there's a fence there now. But these borders are human constructs, but they clarify where one set of institutions stops and another set of institutions begin. That's an important distinction between states, but again, not unique. Here we have the Boy Scouts with their Grand Canyon Council. There's a line drawn, and as you go from Arizona to Utah, for example, you cross over into a different jurisdiction, a different council for the Boy Scouts. This brings us to the element of the state that really sets it apart from other institutions. The state is that set of institutions within a geographic territory which have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. States can use force. States decide who gets to use force in society and who doesn't get to use force in their society. This is something that other institutions don't have. The Boy Scouts, they don't have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. They may use force. You get one troop knocking another troop with a bunch of sticks and throwing rocks and things, but that use of force is not legitimate. Somebody gets in trouble for using force in that regard. States have the power to use force, and states jealously guard that monopoly. And the key word here is legitimate. Other actors may use force, but the state is the only actor that can legitimately use force. States jealously guard that monopoly, that ability to have them and only them decide when force is used. For example, there was a story here in Phoenix a few years ago of a homeowner who was broken into. And he called the police and said, hey, I had the things robbed. The police duly noted it, said they'd send someone eventually, and that was that. The next day, the homeowner was robbed again. So he called the police. I was robbed again. The police say, well, that's some terrible bad luck you've had. They take note of it, promise to send someone to investigate, and that's it. The third day, this homeowner is robbed again, and this time his car keys are stolen. He calls the police. They say, okay, that's terrible luck. We'll start investigation. The fourth day in a row, the thief comes again and gets in the car to claim his vehicle. He takes the stolen keys, sticks it in the ignition switch, turns it on to steal the car, and nothing happens because the homeowner had disconnected the battery, anticipating this. So the thief gets out of the car. The homeowner jumps out from behind a bush, waving a handgun, and says, freeze, I've got you. The thief turns and runs. The homeowner shoots the gun, shoots the thief in the leg. The police arrive, follow a trail of blood to an apartment nearby, and there, inside the apartment, are all the items stolen from the homeowner over the previous 3 days. All right, the question here is, who spends more time in jail? And the answer is the homeowner spends more time in jail than the robber. That's because the homeowner violated the limitation on the use of force. You're not allowed to shoot an unarmed person who's running away from you. That's against the law. And the penalty for doing that is higher than the penalty for theft. So only the state gets to decide when you can and cannot use deadly force. Likewise, even the very instruments of the state have rules that they cannot use force beyond that set of rules. Another story in Chandler several years ago, a woman was addicted to prescription drugs and was forging a prescription in a Walgreens in a drive-thru. The Walgreens call the police, give the woman her prescription drugs because they don't want to create a scene. And as she's beginning to drive away, a Chandler police officer, motorcycle cop, pulls his motorcycle in front of the car to stop her path, jumps off the police car and pulls his gun out and aims it at the woman behind the steering wheel. She panics and lets her foot off the brake. Her car moves forward, running into the motorcycle, and the police officer fires his gun into the car, killing the woman and narrowly missing the baby who was in the car seat behind the woman. Okay, what happens in that situation? Well, the police officer was arrested for discharging his weapon unlawfully. He ended up being acquitted, but he lost his job because there are strict rules that the police are supposed to follow. And you hear stories of police officers being sent to jail for violating those rules. So even the very instruments of the state have to abide by the rules that the state has put forward, because the state again, jealously guards that monopoly. Only the institutions of the state get to decide when you can and cannot use force. This criteria of how well a state maintains its monopoly on the use of force is a key factor for whether a state is considered to be a weak state or a strong state. If there are places where a state cannot enforce their monopoly on the use of force, that's called a safe haven. That's where non-state actors can operate with impunity. They can use force. They do not fear the instruments of the government. Here's a picture of some citizens of the northern tribal region in Pakistan. There's whole sections of Pakistan where the government cannot go because they will not live long if they do. That is evidence that Pakistan is a very weak state. Another example would be Colombia. Colombia is gaining ground on their rebels that have been fighting for decades, but for a good period of time in the 1990s, the FARC, who are the leftist rebels down there, controlled entire regions of the government. They controlled the schools, they collected the taxes, they provided the hospitals, not the government. So Colombia was seen as a very weak government. Now, as Colombia has rolled back the territory the FARC controls, Colombia is reasserting its strength and reestablishing its monopoly on the use of force. Another factor here of statehood is that states in the current global system are seen as independent and sovereign, meaning they're not appendages to a global empire. They are separate states that act independent of one another. They're sovereign, and sovereignty means that that set of institutions, the state, has the supreme independent authority over a geographic area. There is a general principle of the international community of non-interference. Now, we'll talk later about how this developed, this fact that states, that the current system is a system of independent sovereign states. But that the point for today is that is the system we live in. Now, the example here is the countries voting at the UN. Those votes are non-binding, meaning countries will decide whether or not to agree with a resolution. And if a resolution passes, only countries who voted for it are bound to follow that resolution. Now, that's different than domestic law. With domestic law, it is binding, the decisions that are made. So that's one of the key distinctions between domestic and international law, because we live in a system of independent, sovereign states. These states that interact in this system accord each other certain privileges that come with sovereignty. One of those privileges is the right to hold an embassy within your country's borders. And on that embassy, the grounds that the embassy is on are considered the sovereign territory of the visiting state, so that the domestic law does not apply inside of the territory that embassy is sitting on top of. So here's a picture of the proposed U.S. embassy that they're planning on building in Beijing, China. It's quite a large institution, which indicates the relative size of those two countries and how important that relationship is. But the point is that as soon as an American or even a Chinese person walks onto the grounds of that embassy, they're no longer in China as far as international law is concerned. They're in the United States of America. And as soon as an employee in that embassy leaves that grounds, they leave the United States and they enter China. And Chinese law exists on the sidewalk, while American law is what would hold inside the wall on the other side of the sidewalk. Other privileges that states give one another are consulates, which are essentially mini embassies that conduct the state's business in towns that are important but not capital cities. They provide diplomatic immunity, so diplomats can travel to and from their embassies without being searched, without being stopped at the border. They're allowed to have a pouch, a diplomatic pouch, and they can put whatever they want inside that pouch. And the customs will not look through that pouch. And that's a privilege that states give one another so that they can engage in business in privacy. So these are some of the privileges that come with being a sovereign state. So how does a state, a set of institutions, get access to those kinds of privileges? Well, there's some criteria that usually have to be met to be recognized. So this is where we focus on the word legitimate in Weber's definition here. A state is seen as legitimate both within a country and external legitimacy outside of a country. So on the international scale, external legitimacy is determined by whether or not a state can demonstrate an ability to govern its own territory. If it claims to control a territory, but it cannot enforce its monopoly on the use of force in that territory, it's difficult for that state to claim to its sovereign rights. It also needs to be willing to participate in foreign affairs, and that generally means accepting the norms of the international state system. So a country that wants to be accorded the privileges of sovereignty needs to be willing to accord those privileges to other actors on the international stage. An example here is the Taliban. When the Taliban controlled Afghanistan, it controlled about 95% of the territory of Afghanistan. But the Taliban were sort of a radical, militant Islamic group, and that led them to believe that all of the international institutions were illegitimate. They had no interest in going to the United Nations. They had no interest in upholding the Geneva Conventions. They had no desire to engage in foreign relations and exchange embassies with European powers. They were an isolated regime on purpose. They intentionally isolated themselves. There were only, I think, 3 countries that recognized the Taliban as a legitimate government and exchanged embassies with them. The rest of the world did not, and they did not extend the right of recognition to anybody else. Instead, the Northern Alliance, who controlled about 5% of the territory of Afghanistan, just in the very northern part of the country, the mountains where the Taliban had not been able to dislodge them, that group, even though they only controlled a small sliver of Afghanistan, continued to hold Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations because that group did want to participate in foreign affairs, and they accepted the norms of the international community, mainly because they wanted their help to reconquer the rest of the country. But it's an important case study in why states gain external legitimacy. So we can again ask, what would life be like without belonging to a state? Now, the next unit, we'll look at how the world ended up this way. How did we have a world that's divided into independent sovereign states instead of any number of other ways we could have organized humanity, tribes, empires, corporate entities? We don't have any of that. We have independent sovereign states is the organizing principle who live in a condition of anarchy. The next units in this module of lectures will examine how that came to be. This presentation was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.